Peru, in particular on the day of the assumption of the resounding President Keiko Fujimori, to whom I wish a prosperous mandate. His victory is undoubtedly another indication of the inexorable advance of the ideas of freedom in the region. I want to thank Rector Jose Antonio Chan Escovedo and the rest of the authorities of the Universidad de San Martin de Porres for this honorary doctorate. It is an honor to receive it, along with a distinguished list of personalities that have been decorated by this prestigious institution. I take this noble recognition as a reward for everything we have achieved in just over 2 years of government, but also as a responsibility to continue to be at the height of what this historical moment demands. We, from our government action, I think we are basically making 3 contributions.
Desde nuestra acción de gobierno, creo que estamos haciendo básicamente 3 aportes.
One, we apply every day in our decisions.
Todos los días en nuestras decisiones, que es el criterio.
That is the criterion of morality as a state policy. The other contribution that we are making is our way of understanding the problem of
nuestra forma de entender la problemática del crecimiento económico.
Economic growth. Basically, days ago, together with Dr. Riedo, we were studying the preliminary
junto al Dr. Reidel, estuvimos difundiendo el preliminar
of a working paper that has to do with economic growth issues, where basically
con las cuestiones de crecimiento económico, donde básicamente
there are 3 contributions. The first contribution is that we share that there can be optimal growth.
La primera contribución es que demostramos que puede haber crecimiento óptimo bajo rendimientos
under growing performance, and that this is an internal solution.
en una solución interior.
Specifically, it was an idea that I had been maturing for many years.
Yo venía madurando hace muchos años que la vía
I had shaped it with different applications in one of my recent works called
aplicaciones en uno de mis recientes trabajos que se llama Capitalismo, Socialismo y la Trampa Neoclásica.
Capitalism, Socialism and the Neoclassical Trap, and that some parts of the solution
Partes de la solución del trabajo requería de una matemática
of the work require very sophisticated mathematics. In fact, one of the 3
Una de las 3 contribuciones es propiamente
contributions is properly and absolutely novel application of Bellman's barriers.
barreras de Bellman por primera vez
For the first time in an article on economic growth, to be able to solve this
para poder resolver este modelo con rendimientos crecientes.
model with growing performance. The idea of growing performance is what is behind
Está detrás del crecimiento económico.
economic growth, and basically if you take the series armed by Angus Maddison from
Las series armadas por Angus Maddison desde el inicio de la era cristiana.
the beginning of the Christian era, and you look at the GDP per capita, it was practically constant
Durante 1800 años.
for 1800 years. Specifically, it only went up 40% after the discovery of America,
El
and
descubrimiento de América. Y si ustedes eso lo pusieran en tasa
if you put that in a new compound growth rate, the world would expand to a rate of
una tasa del 0,02%.
0.2% annually. That is to say that to be able to duplicate the GDP per capita it needed
Per cápita se necesitaban 3.500 años.
3,500 years. However, after the Industrial Revolution, we lived a period where the population
Vivimos un periodo donde la población, habiéndose multiplicado por 10,
having multiplied by 10, the GDP per capita did it 15 times. That is, the GDP
creció 150 veces.
grew 150 times.
Eso, digamos,
That and economic theory is characterized by
se caracteriza por lo que se llaman rendimientos
what are
crecientes.
co-occurring performance, and the growth rate went from 0.2 to
Pasó de 0,02 a niveles del 0,66.
levels of 0.66 in the 19th century. In the 20th century, it accelerated again. In the first part, it did
La
it.
primera parte lo hizo al 1
to 1. In the second part, it did it up to 2. And if one looks at what is going on in the 21st century, despite all the atrocities that are happening, it does it around 3. On the other hand, when you look at the number of years that have been needed to duplicate the GDP per capita as history progresses, the first one to achieve it was England. It took practically a century. However, as time goes by, that is achieved more and more quickly. The most emblematic case is China, which basically duplicated as GDP per capita in 10 years because it grew by 7%, and then it also did it in 7 years. Because it managed to accelerate to 10. That is, what one sees is that the growth rate, despite the pessimist, is accelerating. That is the only thing that could stop this is the state. That is the reality. But the important thing is the question of growing yields, because the counterpart of the growing yields in the neoclassical theory are the concentrated market structures. And from the point of view of the neoclassical theory, the neoclassical concentrated market structures are not optimal and therefore are bad. And consequently, the question that one should ask is, how can it be something bad? Something that made that in almost 250 years the population multiplied more than 10 times and more.
Se multiplicara más de 10 veces la población y más de 15 veces el producto per cápita.
Then 15 times the GDP per capita, and their extreme poverty went from levels of 95% to less than 10%. It is a reasonable question. That is, how can we say that it is bad? Something that generated so much well-being and took so many people out of poverty. With Dr. Riedel, we propose to answer that question and try to internalize what was failing in the traditional models of economic growth and what we were proposing to get out of those traps. Sorry that I'm going to get a little neoclassical, and I'm not going to be so Austrian, but it seemed to me that we had given the magnitude of the distinction and the mentions to my academic work as an economist, it was worth entering on this side. And then the Austrian will appear, stay calm. They are going to perceive it quickly. But the interesting thing here is that neoclassical models usually have, you have seen the Robinson Crusoe model. If the Robinson Crusoe model, Robinson on the one hand decides what to consume, he changes the cat, he becomes a producer and decides what to produce. So the model has some interesting things, such as a first vision of a very simple general balance model. But that, extended to more complex models, has a series of important difficulties. Specifically, the radical problem is that when you work with the idea of the invisible hand, but put in a wall format, that is, in the neoclassical format, where each of the agents, guided by their own interest, leads to general well-being in the neoclassical format, it requires that each individual is maximizing. And if you put it in the mathematical format of maximization, a convex function does not have a maximum. Basically, except that they have a corner solution. In that corner solution, they would have that then everything would be in the hands of a single company. And we also tried the solution in the hands of a single individual. It was called communism. It was the state. It could not calculate prices. It failed. Therefore,
¿Cómo
what is the
es
way to compute this problem? What
la
we think
forma
is
de
that
computar este problema? Lo que a nosotros nos parece es que esa separación, esa
separation,
bipolaridad que
that
muestra el
bipolarity
señor
that Mr. Robinson Crusoe shows has to be
se
resolved
tiene que
within
resolver dentro del propio Robinson Crusoe. Es decir,
Robinson
el momento
Crusoe
en que
himself,
Robinson
that
Crusoe
is, the
decide
moment in which Robinson
qué
Crusoe
consumir,
decides
también al
what to
mismo
consume.
momento está
Also, at the
decidiendo,
same time, he is deciding how
digamos,
many times he
cuántas
climbs the
veces se
tree
sube
to
al árbol para bajar cocos y comer.
eat.
En ese
In that
contexto,
context, what happens? As you
¿qué
consume
es lo que
more,
sucede?
the utility there,
En la medida que ustedes van consumiendo más, la utilidad que derivan de ese consumo es cada vez
he
mayor.
derived from that consumption is
Pero
increasingly greater, but proportionally is
menor.
less.
Es decir, ustedes
That
van
is,
teniendo utilidad. Su
you are
utilidad
having
sube,
utility, your
pero
utility
sube
rises, but it rises
decresciblemente.
decreasingly. But at the same
Pero
time,
al mismo tiempo, para conseguir esa unidad
to get that additional unit of consumption, you have to deliver more work. That is, you have to
ustedes tienen que entregar más trabajo, es decir, tienen que entregar ocio.
deliver leisure, and that leisure futility is you work more hours. That futility
Van trabajando más horas, esa desutilidad es cada vez mayor.
is increasingly greater.
Ustedes,
So you,
cada
each unit
unidad
of
de
consumption
consumo
that
que
you
suben,
raise, have more
tienen
utility,
más utilidad, pero crece
but it grows
decrescentemente.
decreasingly.
Pero
But at the
al
same
mismo
time that
tiempo
you are
que van
working more,
trabajando más, la desutilidad
the
crece
uselessness grows
decrecientemente.
decreasingly. Then there
Entonces
comes a
llega un
time when what
momento
you
que lo
earn
que
for
ustedes
one
ganan por una unidad más de consumo
unit more of
queda
consumption is balanced
equilibrado
with what you
con lo
lose
que
for delivering
pierden
one more unit of
por
leisure.
entregar una unidad más de ocio. Y ese momento es el
And that
momento donde
moment
ustedes
is a moment when you find the limit
el
of
límite de
production.
producción.
You are going to be
Ustedes van a estar maximizando su utilidad
maximizing your
a
utility
pesar,
despite the
digamos, que el
fact that the
formato
format of
de
the
la
production
función de
function is
producción
growing,
sea creciente, porque el problema es lo que
because the
ustedes
problem
están
is what you
entregando
are
en materia
delivering
de
in the
ocio.
matter of
Es
leisure.
decir, porque para
That is
producir
because
necesitan
to produce you need
trabajar
to work,
y
and
por ende
therefore you need to
necesitan
deliver
entregar
leisure.
ocio.
And that
Y
allows
eso
you
les
to get
permite conseguir un máximo.
a maximum.
Eso resuelve
That solves
el
the
primer
first problem of
problema
having an interior
de tener
solution
una
where you
solución
can
interior donde ustedes pueden conseguir un máximo,
hit a maximum, but despite having a
pero
production
a
function with
pesar de
growing
tener una
performance,
función de producción con rendimientos crecientes.
why?
¿Por qué? Porque lo
Because we
integramos
integrate
adentro de
it
la
into the
decisión del
consumer's
consumidor.
decision. It enters
Ingresa dentro de la función de utilidad y habida
within
de
the
efecto
utility function, and there is the effect of
de
the
la
uselessness that
desutilidad que
causes
causa poner cada vez más ocio.
increasingly more leisure,
Y
and
eso
that
es una
is a static
solución
solution.
estática. El problema es
The
cuando
problem
van a
is
una
when you go
solución
to a
dinámica.
dynamic
La
solution.
solución
The
dinámica
dynamic solution, what
lo
is
que va
it
a
going to imply
implicar
is that
es
multiple
que aparecen equilibrios múltiples.
equilibria,
Digo, que
and
ustedes
the
van a
problem
tener
is that you are
tres
going to have three
equilibrios.
equilibria. You are
Van a
going to have
tener
two that
dos que son estables y uno que es
are
inestable.
stable and one that is
Van
unstable.
a tener
You are going to
una
have one with a
con
trap
trampa de
of poverty
pobreza,
where
donde
the
la población se vuelve pobre,
population
y
becomes
van a
poor, and
tener
you are going to
uno
have one
donde
where the
la
population reaches wealth.
población
Those
alcanza la riqueza. Esos dos equilibrios son estables.
two equilibria are
Y hay un
stable, and there
equilibrio
is an
intermedio
intermediate
que es
equilibrium that
inestable.
isn't stable. So the
Entonces,
question
la pregunta es, ¿qué nos lleva
is
hacia
what
un
leads us to one
equilibrio o hacia
equilibrium or
otro
to another
equilibrio?
equilibrium. So here the interesting thing is,
Entonces, acá lo interesante es qué es lo que determina la
what
escala
determines the
mínima.
minimum scale?
Hay un
There is a
nivel
level
de
of capital that
que
determines the
determina la
minimum
escala
scale
mínima debajo del cual nos hundimos
below
en
which
la
we sink into
pobreza
poverty inexorably.
inexorablemente.
That minimum scale level has
Ese nivel
associated
de escala mínima tiene asociado un nivel de capital.
a
Y ese
level of
nivel de
capital, and that level of
tiene
capital has
asociado
associated two
dos
elements.
elementos.
It has associated
Tiene asociado mi voluntad
my will to work.
de trabajar.
That is to say, if I am a lazy
Es decir,
person,
si
I do
yo
not know
soy
what word is
vago,
used.
no sé qué palabra, ¿se usa vago acá también? Ok.
Something here is
si
also
soy
used.
un perezoso,
Okay, that
en
is, if
términos
I am a
de
lazy
slang,
person in terms of domestic
sería
slang,
vago.
it would be
Es decir,
lazy.
si no me gusta
That is, if I
trabajar,
do
me
not like to
hundo.
work, I sink. That is,
Es
if
decir,
I am. This was said by
soy-
Friedman.
Digamos, esto lo decía Friedman. Tenemos una sociedad
We have a society
cada
that
vez
increasingly
castiga
punishes the
más
one
al que
who works and
trabaja
favors the lazy. Well,
y favorece al vago. Bueno, eso no termina bien. Se
That
llama
does not end
justicia
well.
social.
It is called
Justicia
social
social es
justice.
injusta porque implica un
Social
trato desigual
justice is
frente a la
unjust
ley,
because it
y
implies
además es
an
robarle a
unequal
uno para
treatment
dar a
against the
otro.
law, and it is
Bueno,
also
eso no
stealing from
termina
one
bien,
to give to
digamos, la
another.
gente
Well,
frente a esa
that
situación
does not end well.
prefiere valorar el
People in
ocio,
the face of that
es
situation
decir, se
prefer
puede
to value
consumir de
leisure.
todas maneras,
That is, if
digamos,
I'm
la
going to
solución que
consume
tiene
in
más
always,
ocio
the
domina.
solution that is more leisure
Bueno, eso
dominates.
en términos dinámicos
Well,
es un
that in
desastre.
dynamic terms is a
Es decir,
disaster.
ahora también
That
ustedes
is, Nelly could
podrían
also be working,
estar trabajando, pero ahorrar poco.
but saving little.
Es decir, una
That is,
sociedad que
in a
ahorra
society
poco,
that saves little, or
o
because
porque
it
le
likes
gusta
to
despilfarrar, o porque pondera el
waste, or
consumo
because it puts the
presente,
present
porque
consumption, or
su
because its
tasa de
rate of
referencia intertemporal es demasiada
interest is too high,
alto,
such that it is
tal que luce
short-sighted.
como un
If you
miope.
do not move
Digamos, si ustedes no trasladan consumo al futuro, es decir, no ahorran, no
consumption
acumulan
to the
capital,
future, that is, you do not save,
también
you
se
do not
hunde.
accumulate capital, consequently you
Es
also
decir, que
sink.
es importante,
That is, the culture
la
of work is
cultura del
important and the
trabajo,
culture of saving is
y es
important.
importante la cultura del ahorro. Es decir,
That is,
sociedades que
societies
piensen
that
en el
think in the
largo
long run
plazo,
and those elements become fundamental.
y esos elementos se
Now,
vuelven fundamentales. Ahora, eso es una de las partes.
that is one of the parts.
Lo que,
So if I have societies that
entonces, si yo
save
tengo
little or
sociedades que
societies
ahorran poco, o sociedades que
that
básicamente
basically
no
did
les
not
gusta
like to work, or
trabajar,
populist societies,
o
what
sociedades
it would do is sink.
populistas, lo que va a hacer es hundirme. Y les doy un ejemplo.
And I will give you an
Argentina
example.
era un país
Argentina was a developed country at the beginning of the 20th century.
cuando nosotros llegamos
When we arrived, it was half the table down, and we were on our way to
para abajo, e íbamos camino a convertirnos Cuba con escala en Venezuela.
turn Cuba into Venezuela. That is what left us, and the
Eso es
legacy
lo
of
que nos
populism.
dejó y el legado del populismo. El populismo, o sea, destruyó
Populism
la cultura
destroyed
del
the
trabajo,
culture of work, destroyed the culture
destruyó
of
la
saving.
cultura del ahorro. Entonces,
So there has to
eso
do
tiene
with
que
this
ver
bad balance.
con este
How do you enter the good
equilibrio
balance?
malo. ¿Cómo uno entra al equilibrio bueno? Desde la batalla cultural,
From the cultural battle, promoting the culture of work, the culture of saving,
digamos, la cultura del ahorro, de pensar en el largo plazo.
of thinking in the long run, but it is also important to
También
respect
es
property rights.
importante el respeto del derecho a propiedad. Nosotros hemos
We have something called the May Pact, and the first point of the May Pact
y el primer punto del Pacto de Mayo es el respeto
is respect for property rights and the right to
El
property.
derecho de propiedad
You can
ustedes
attack
lo
it
pueden
in
atacar de dos maneras. Hay
two
una que
ways.
es bien violenta
There
y
is
que,
one that is
digamos,
very
es muy
violent
clara,
and that is very clear, which is the
es
case
el
of taxes.
caso de los impuestos. Cuando ustedes cobran
When you charge
impuestos,
taxes, I do not
a
like,
mí-
for
a mí
example, to
no
say
me gusta, por ejemplo, decirle contribuyente al pagador de
taxpayer is a
impuestos.
contributor.
No, yo digo pagador de
No, I
impuestos.
say taxpayer.
Digo,
I
nadie
say
paga
nobody
los impuestos voluntariamente,
pays
se
taxes
pagan
voluntarily.
a punta de
They pay
pistola.
at the tip of a gun.
Es
It is pure
coacción
coercion.
pura. Es decir, si ustedes no
That
pagan
is,
los
if you do
impuestos,
not pay
van
taxes,
presos.
you go to jail. Consequently, that is why they are
Por
called
eso se llaman
taxes.
impuestos. Digamos,
They are
no
not
son-
paid
no se pagan
voluntarily.
voluntariamente.
There is no such thing
No
as
hay
a
tal
social
cosa como un
contract.
contrato
It is a
social.
lie.
Es mentira.
So they pay them
Entonces,
because
los
if they
pagan
do not
porque
go
si
to
no,
jail,
van
it is that
presos. Es
simple.
así de simple. Entonces,
So that is a way of
esa es una
attacking property
forma de
rights.
atacar al derecho a
They are their
propiedad.
way of attacking
La otra forma de atacar al derecho a propiedad es con una regulación.
property rights is with a regulation. For example,
ejemplo,
suppose that you have a building
Suponga que ustedes tienen un edificio donde se dedican
where they are dedicated to renting apartments, for
arrendar
example, offices.
departamentos,
What happens if a politician comes
por ejemplo, oficinas. ¿Qué pasa si viene
and imposes rent control?
político y
Well,
les
what
pone
is
un
going to
control
happen
de
is what
alquileres,
happened.
un control de rentas? Bueno, lo que va a pasar es lo que pasó en Argentina.
In
Vino un
Argentina,
imbécil, puso
an
una
idiot
ley de
came, he
control de
passed a rent
alquileres
control law, and he
y
retracted
se
the amount of
retra-
rents
y se retrajo a la mitad la cantidad de alquileres
in half and
y
violently
subió
raised the price.
violentamente el
In short,
precio.
that idiot who wanted to
En definitiva, ese imbécil que quería defender a los más vulnerables,
defend the most vulnerable
dejó
left the most
en la
vulnerable
calle
on
a
the
los más
street because
vulnerables.
given that the
Porque dado que la curva de demanda tiene pendiente negativa,
demand curve has a
digo,
negative
solamente
slope, only those who are willing to pay more price
departamentos aquellos que estaban dispuestos a pagar
got
más
apartments.
precio.
Consequently, he threw millions of people on the street,
A millones de personas, justamente con menos recursos,
precisely with fewer resources, who were the ones who could pay those properties that
que
were at
estaban a precios más baratos.
cheaper prices, with a way to degrade the prices by letting the quality of
la calidad de la vivienda en alquiler.
rental housing decrease. Consequently, one of the things that we did better, we assumed, was to erase the rent law. Well, the offer was doubled and the price dropped by 30% in real times. It is one of the measures that worked a lot very quickly. Apart from that, why do I quote this? Because if you have a regulated economy, at the maximum level to which you can access and reach GDP, the more you regulate, the lower it is. In other words, the model has a closed solution, but the more you regulate and punish property rights, the lower you can reach. So you are going to see that those economies that are more overregulated are the ones that grow the least. If you want a very specific example of that, it is basically the European Union, where each regulation that they impose is a blow to economic growth. Therefore, this model allows you to find the trap of poverty.
Este modelo permite encontrar trampa de pobreza,
allows you to find growth with growing performance, but without being accusive, believing that trees can reach the sky. That is, the model has a closed solution. And to be able to achieve and determine that closed solution, we innovate that in reality this. The truth of strict rigor is the merit of Riedo, my co-author, who is a physicist, who found that Bellman's barriers allowed him to solve that problem. So, while all the models of endogenous growth with growing performance use patches so that trees do not grow to the sky, in this model the trees do not grow to the sky, because basically what ends up acting as a limiting factor is the loss of bloom. It is as if I told them, who of you is willing to accept a job in which I am going to pay $120 million per year? Who is willing to take that job? All of them? Well, I'm going to pay that on December 31, that is, when the calendar year ends. That is, we start the first one in April. I pay them on December 31, and it also requires that they work 24 hours a day. How many now accept the job? They cannot actually fulfill it. It is impossible, that is, because the level of subtlety that they are going to have by delivering all that bone is that they die. So the model could not give anything. He just had to find the math that would solve it. It was called Bellman's berries. Therefore, it is interesting because if you look at it, we base our growth strategy on three pillars. On the one hand, in deregulation. In second place, in human capital, and third, in the opening of the economy. But clearly, before we had to stabilize the economy, before the price system had to work. So, for example, look how important when we arrived. Now the application comes in the practice of the model. When we arrived at the function, we found that we had a consolidated fiscal deficit of 15 points of the GDP, 5 in a treasury, and 10 in a central bank. I had campaigned with a chainsaw and promised to close the fiscal deficit in a year.
cerrar el déficit fiscal en un año. Todo el mundo
Everyone
decía
said
que
it was
era
impossible. Well, not only did we achieve it in a year,
Bueno, nosotros no solo que lo logramos en un año, gracias al ministro
thanks to Minister Luis Toto Cafita, the President of the Central Bank, Santiago Bosei,
del Banco Central, Santiago Bausili, y quien está hoy aquí
and who
como
is here today is Chancellor, who at that time was the Secretary of Finance.
Cerramos el desequilibrio
We closed the fiscal imbalance in a month. We closed the imbalance of the Treasury in a month.
Cerramos el desequilibrio del Tesoro en un mes. Bajamos el gasto
We lowered the
público
public spending 30%. We reduced the ministries by half.
Ministerios a la mitad. Entonces,
So basically, not only that, but also in the middle of the economy,
además, en la medida que la economía se empezó a expandir, bajamos los
it began to
impuestos
expand.
e
We lowered
hicimos
the
lo que
taxes,
nunca
and we did
hizo
what no
ningún
government
gobierno en la
in
historia argentina, que fue devolverle a los
Argentine history has ever
argentinos
done,
3
which
puntos
was
del
to
PBI,
return to the
bajar impuestos.
Argentines 3 points of the GDP in
Y en
low
6
taxes, and in
meses
6 months we closed the fiscal
cerramos
imbalance
el
of the central
desequilibrio
bank.
fiscal
Therefore,
del Banco Central. Por lo tanto, en 6 meses habíamos
in
hecho un
6
ajuste
months we had made a
fiscal
fiscal
15
adjustment of
puntos del
15
PBI.
points of the GDP, and in what followed,
Siguió, llegó a 18 puntos del
it reached
PBI.
18 points of the
Es decir, que
GDP. That
nosotros
is, we
hicimos
made
un
an
ajuste
adjustment that we
que
returned
le
to the private
devolvimos al
sector
sector privado 100.000 millones de
$100 billion.
dólares.
Then it is not
Entonces,
magic
no es
that poverty
magia que
has
haya
fallen
caído la
poverty when we
pobreza.
arrived.
La pobreza cuando llegamos, que la sinceramos, era del 57%.
When honestly reported was
en la
57% in the monthly
frecuencia
frequency.
mensual.
Today it is 29%. That is, we
Sacamos a 14 millones
take
de
out 14
argentinos de la
million
pobreza.
Argentinians from poverty. The indigency was 20%. Today it is 6%.
6%. Y básicamente teníamos
And basically we had 70% of poor children, and today it is 42%. Clearly there is a lot of work to do, that we have advanced in the correct direction, not only because what we achieve in terms of the fall of poverty and indigency in child poverty, but also the inflation now. When we arrived ran at 1.5 a day, the
digamos, ojalá, digamos, el poco lúcido
little lucid predecessor that I had knew how to calculate the compound interest of how much it is.
el interés compuesto de cuánto es 1,5 diario.
1.5 a day. Someone has a calculator so that that person realizes when he says that 17,000% per year was impossible because he was running next to him. In fact, the consumer inflation gave 54% per month. The annualized gives 17,000. I don't know a 54, but yes, clearly we both had.
Pero sí claramente, digamos, nosotros teníamos teníamos 4 bases monetarias.
4 monetary bases winning in one day. We had the equivalent in debt in pesos.
10 bases monetarias venciendo.
For 10 monetary bases winning in less than 30 days, we had a monetary imbalance.
El doble del Rodrigazo que implicó
That was twice the Roger Goza that implied multiplying inflation by 6 from one moment to the
multiplicarlo
other, and that would have implied multiplying it by 12. We had a break in the central bank, worse than the one we had in the previous hyperinflation of funds in 89, and we had
sociales peores que lo del 2000.
worse social indicators in that of 2001, that is next to the hell.
El infierno parecía un lugar confortable.
Comfortable, but what is the important thing about this, that we returned to the private sector 18 points.
¿Qué es lo importante de esto? Que le devolvimos al sector privado 18 puntos del PBI.
At the GDP, and that is equivalent to having increased savings, and this is also important
Y esto también es importante porque cuando tuvimos que hacer el ajuste,
because when we had to make the adjustment, if you were waiting for the future growth to
si
come,
ustedes lo hacen esperando que venga el crecimiento futuro y lo hacen tomando deuda,
and you do it taking that is to collect taxes to future generations, that is, you would be spending the count of today's party on your children, grandchildren, and people who perhaps have not yet been born, which is deeply immoral to raise taxes.
subir los impuestos cercena la libertad.
Freedom is arisen. It is also deeply immoral. Therefore, what we did is,
Por lo tanto, lo que nosotros hicimos es bajar el gasto público.
Lower public spending, we gave back freedom to people, and it works because today the inflation rate
Y funciona. Porque hoy la tasa de inflación en Argentina está en torno
in
al
Argentina is around 30%, and we are going to continue to maintain our high fiscal policy.
Es decir, ayer vino
That is, yesterday, the Director General of the International Monetary Fund, Cristalina
Georgieva, y antes de reunirse con
Georgieva came, and before meeting with part of the team, she was with her staff, and we
su staff y nosotros
were part of the government team, and previously she was in my office. They know that there is in my office.
previo estuvo en mi despacho. ¿Saben qué hay en mi despacho, en la mesa donde yo trabajo?
At the table where I work a chainsaw, look if I have commitment with the tax balance.
Compromiso con el equilibrio fiscal. No solo eso.
Not only that, tomorrow when I return to Buenos Aires, I start writing the speech that I'm going to
Pongo a escribir el discurso que voy a dar en cadena nacional el
give
jueves,
on national TV on
donde
Thursday,
explico
where I
la
explain the reform of the central bank, where basically
donde básicamente el Banco
the central
Central va
bank
a
is
volver
going
a
to have
tener
again
como
as its
misión
fundamental mission to preserve the value of the
preservar el valor de la moneda. Este domingo que
currency.
pasó,
This Sunday that passed, I published an article in a newspaper called Clarin, and the
el título era 12
title was 12 trillion, well, a number of 20 figures, that is, about 13 trillion.
o sea, cerca de 13 trillones. Bueno, esa es la inflación que tuvo
Well, that is the
Argentina
inflation that
desde
Argentina had from 1935 to today. It is more when Argentina
Argentina dejó la convertibilidad y dijo,
left the
"Esta vez sí va a ser
convertibility and said that
diferente,
this time
y
it
van a
was going to be
manejar el Banco
different,
Central
and that they were going to
criterios de prudencia,
handle the central
eficiencia,
bank with criteria of prudence, efficiency. I
acumulamos
do not know what else. We
168.000%
accumulated
de inflación.
268,000% of inflation. Well, we are going to end up with 91 years of scam, and not only
No solo
that,
eso, porque va a volver a ser
because it would do the function of the central bank to preserve the value of the currency again.
va a
It will
estar
be
prohibido financiar de manera directa
forbidden
o
to finance a fiscal
indirectamente
directly or indirectly. It is
se lo
considered a scam,
considera
and
una
being
estafa, y al ser considerado una estafa va a ser una asociación
considered a scam is
ilícita,
going to be an
por lo cual
illicit
van a ir
association,
presos
so they
el
are going to
presidente
go
del
to
Banco
prison.
Central y
The
el directorio, el
president
poder
of the central bank
ejecutivo
and the
y
board,
diputados y
the
senadores
executive
que
power,
aprueban
and
presupuesto
deputies
que
and
implique
senators who
déficit fiscal
approve a budget that implies a fiscal
financiado por
deficit
emisión
financed with
monetaria, porque es
monetary
una
emissions, because
falsificación.
it is
La
a
falsificación de dinero es un
falsification. The
delito penal
falsification
y
of money
además
is a criminal offense,
no es
and also it is
cancelable.
jailable.
Por lo tanto, aquellos
Therefore,
que
those who
decidan
decide to
violar el
violate the fiscal
equilibrio
balance
fiscal
are going to
van
end
a
up in
terminar
prison.
presos.
Naturally, we are also going to take care of the independence of the central bank by shielding
Naturalmente, también vamos a cuidar la independencia del Banco Central blindando a las autoridades del Banco
the
Central.
authorities of the central bank. So today it
Entonces,
requires
hoy
two-thirds
requiere
of the
dos
Senate
tercios
to
del
remove
Senado. Bueno, para remover a un funcionario. Bueno, va a necesitar dos tercios
a
del
function.
Senado y
It will
dos
need
tercios de la
two-thirds
Cámara
of
de
the Senate
Diputados.
and two-thirds of
Por
the
lo
House
tanto,
of
cuando venga un
Representatives.
político y quiera
Therefore, when a
chantajear
politician
al
comes
presidente del
and
Banco
wants to
Central,
throw his
no va a
desire
poder.
at the president of the central bank,
No va a
he will
poder.
not be able
Por
to.
lo
He will
tanto,
not be able
el
to.
Banco
Therefore, the
Central
central
va a estar
bank will be
armado
armed
con el
with
poder
enough power
suficiente como para
as to
resistir
resist
cualquier
any
embate
political clash.
político.
We are going to
Vamos a
annihilate once
liquidar
and
de
for
una
all
vez por
inflation.
toda la inflación. Vamos a terminar con
We are
ese
going to end
robo
up with a
siniestro
sinister
que es
death
la
that is the
emisión de
emission of
dinero
money
sin
without
respaldo.
support.
Además,
In addition, this law also has some characteristics about prohibiting non-transferable letters, and that genuine utilities can only be distributed only to
para pagar deuda. Es decir, se
pay debt,
terminó
that
el
is, the
Banco
central
Central
bank
que
that
estafa.
cheats, and at the same
Y
time we
al
are
mismo tiempo estamos devolviendo el ahorro. Eso
returning the
favorece la
savings
acumulación de
that
capital.
favors the accumulation of capital.
Lo otro tiene
The
que
other
ver con
thing
la
has to do
cultura
with the
del
culture
trabajo.
of work. We have never
Nosotros
stopped
no hemos
fighting the
dejado de dar nunca la batalla cultural.
cultural battle, but the most interesting thing is the experience from human
Es la
capital.
experiencia desde capital humano. Desde capital humano
From human
siempre
capital,
nuestra
always our
intención
intention
fue
was
que
that
la
the social
política
policy
social
had to
tenía
stop
que dejar de ser de regalarle el pescado a la
being
gente,
to give fish to people
de
and teach them
enseñarle
to
a
fish.
pescar. De hecho, la
In
frase
fact, the phrase so famous in Chicago by Milton Friedman, there is no such thing as a free lunch.
como un almuerzo gratis, es una
It is a reflection or a reference taken around the Torah,
tomada en torno a la Torá.
The free fish was Egypt. The free fish was slavery. We did not want
Egipto. El pescado es gratis, era la esclavitud. Nosotros no queremos ciudadanos esclavos, nosotros queremos
slave citizens.
ciudadanos
We want
libres.
free citizens, and that is why we
Por eso
changed the format
cambiamos
of
el formato de la política social.
social policy.
Por
That is
eso
why it
dejó
stopped
de
being
ser-
what was the ministry called before.
¿Cómo se llamaba antes? Ministerio, ¿cómo era que se-
But no, before it was a time outside of welfare, social security. No, it is called
Seguridad social, no, se llama de capital humano. Ya
human
solamente
capital,
eso,
only that
gente,
worships Kay
punto,
Becker,
honorary
but not
Becker.
only that.
Pero no solo eso. Nosotros recientemente,
We recently, the
la ministra
Minister
de
of Human
Humano
Capital took a pledge and agreed with companies
tomó un predio y se puso de acuerdo con empresas para revalorizar ese predio.
to
Y
revalidate
en
that
ese
pledge,
predio
and
se
in that
hacen
pledge training is done on jobs.
sobre oficios. ¿Qué es lo interesante?
What is
Cuando
the
el
interesting
ministro
thing?
Petrovelo llegó a la
When the Minister
función,
of Human Capital arrived at work, basically,
básicamente, la gente le pedía planes
people
sociales.
asked for social plans. Today, people ask for work. That is, we are getting out of
trabajo. Es decir, estamos saliendo del equilibrio inmundo en el cual nos hundimos
the
en la
immovable balance,
pobreza.
immaturity, sink into
La
poverty.
gente
People
quiere
want to
trabajar,
work.
la
People
gente quiere vivir dignamente, la gente
want to live
dejó
with
de ser
dignity.
esclava,
People
la
stop
gente
being
quiere
slaves.
ser
People want to be
libre,
free,
y
and
eso
that
nos va a
is
llevar al equilibrio bueno.
going to lead us to good balance. Not only that, the other part is
No solo
deregulation.
eso, la otra parte es la desregulación.
The Minister of Stozenegger has already deregulated 16,500 reforms, 16,500 deregulations.
16.500 desregulaciones. Quita 17 regulaciones.
He removes
por
17
día.
regulations per day. That is, it is the machine of freedom. It is the machine of
Es la máquina de los rendimientos crecientes. Eso
growing
es lo que va a
performance.
generar el
That is what is
crecimiento.
going to generate growth. In the end,
En el fondo, los rendimientos crecientes eran lo que Adam Smith
growing
llamaba
performance
la
was what
fábrica de
Adam
juguetes.
Smith called the pin factory, given the division of
del trabajo. Y esa división del
work, and that
trabajo
division of work was limited by the size of the market. This is very interesting.
Esto es muy interesante porque si
Because if they put the growing performance, the limit they would have today is the size of the
que tendrían hoy, ¿cuál es? El tamaño del mercado. Y la forma de
market and the way to
generar
implement
más
more growing
rendimientos
performance,
crecientes,
that is,
más
more growth,
crecimiento, es agrandando el mercado.
is enlarging the market. And what are we doing?
Estamos
We are opening the
abriendo la
Argentine
economía
economy.
argentina. Hoy la economía argentina, dado
Today, the Argentine economy, given its level of income, is the most closed in the world. It has an opening coefficient of less than 30% and should have one of 90%, and that is why after 25 years, a liberal president had to arrive so that Mercosur would move and obtain the agreement with the European Union, Mercosur. But not only that, we have an agreement with the United States. We have an agreement with EFTA. We are signing the Trans-Pacific Agreement. We are opening the Argentine economy. We are strengthening the growing performance. So I say hard work and capitalism, as Chabasta would say, in that generates prosperity. And the question is, but we still do not talk about growth. Well, Argentina has not grown since 2011. If you take the 100 years before we
Si ustedes toman los 100 años previos a que nosotros llegáramos al poder,
came to power, the average growth rate was 1%. Argentina has been growing for 26 months.
Argentina lleva 26 meses seguido creciendo. Argentina,
if we take the monthly estimate of the economic activity, which is a proxy of the monthly GDP in terms of the stationing, Argentina in the first 2 years grew 10%. Actually, almost 11. That is to say that we are doubling the growth rate that we brought 100 years ago. That is, the model is working, but not only that. There is something very interesting too. Well, but what do the numbers of this year say? To be able to start thinking forward, because someone could say, well, you are levels of maximum historical GDP, maximum historical consumption, maximum historical exportations, but the GDP of the first quarter grew 2.3%. Last year we had a very strong political clash where the Congress imposed 40 laws intended to break the macroeconomic balance. It tried a coup d'etat with 7 attempts of political trial. They also sowed terror in the streets, and not only that, but also in
Y no solo eso, sino que además, en complicidad, empresarios,
complicity, entrepreneurs, that is, pre-vendor entrepreneurs, media, corrupt professionals who are
que son sicarios del mal, trabajaban para que todo volara por los aires. No les fue bien porque la elección ganamos 41-24, o sea...
thugs of evil were to make everything fly through the air. It was not good for them because in the election we won 41-24, that if it had been a presidential. It is implied winning in the first round, that thanks to the work of my sister who created a party. Look, in Argentina, I think a party can demand more or less 7 or 8 years. My sister created 24 parties in 6 months, 1 for each district, and of the 24 districts we won in 16. She does know how to do things, the bakers. I say that because it is a despicable nickname that a political leader put on her. But it seems that she was not able to have the success that she is having with painting the country. But apart from that, the distinction rate of the GDP was 0.7, that is normalized to 3. Now if you notice, that happened with a strong fall in the investment as a result of the political attack we had last year. If the investment, instead of falling, would have remained constant, the GDP would be expanding to 4. If it had done as it did throughout the 21st century, it would be at 5, and if it had done as it is doing during our government, the economy would expand to 7%. Also, that number is consistent with the fact that Argentina by the country risk of 500 basic points could grow at 7%. Today, the country's risk in Argentina is around 400. That is, if we achieve the re-election, because the country's risk of this administration is around 50 basic points, Argentina will be able to grow very strongly. It will undoubtedly double its GDP in 10 years, and it will quadruple it in 20. Argentina will stop being a history of failure, and Argentina will be great again. But basically, someone may be concerned about the situation. I tell them, look, the situation is also going to improve, first because exports grow 5 times faster than the GDP, in case you want to look at it from the side of the demand. On the other hand, the real wage with which that will enhance consumption as inflation falls. When pensions, in real terms, increase, therefore that also motorizes consumption. We also have, in the matter of investment, a large investment regime that has 45 billion approved dollars, but there are already announcements for $150 billion. Therefore, we are going to have a large amount of investment. Not only that, but also we are leasing all the road infrastructure, with which we are also going to have a strong boost from all the infrastructure works, but made by the private sector, and also the fall in the interest rate and the low taxes that will also generate a large amount of value. Consequently, all the conditions are given for Argentina to have a great performance, and that derives from the way in which decisions are made, which is another of the contributions that we have, which is this of morality, is the state policy. We make decisions based on ethical and moral criteria, that is the decisive matrix, and that is above. Economic efficiency, and economic efficiency is above political utility. When you have policies that are fair, those policies are also efficient. It is false that something that is unfair can be efficient. If something is fair, it is also efficient, and if it is efficient, it has to be inexorably fair. That is a beautiful work by Professor Jesus Huerta de Soto, called the theory of dynamic efficiency. And when you take fair measures that are also efficient, that will later derive in verse, what are the four pillars about what we base ourselves on? First, about Greek philosophy, that is the conception of man in Greek philosophy. We base ourselves on Roman law, that is, we are great proponents of natural rights. It is more, when we talk about efficiency, instead of using the Parethian criterion, we propose it with the Hans-Hermann Hoppe criterion, where if you respect natural rights, respect the right to life, liberty, property, that is, you have the principle of appropriation of the law and the principle of non-aggression. With those elements you derive optimality without having to resort to topological structures to make the mathematical demonstration. And we also have an aligned position with the Stoics. Always my favorite example is
nosotros tenemos una posición alineada con los estoicos. Siempre mi ejemplo favorito es el rey Salomón.
King Solomon. King Solomon was a Stoic because when he came to the kingdom, he asked the Creator.
Llega al reino, le pide al Creador.
Basically, he asked for wisdom to be able to distinguish good from evil.
Digamos, le pide sabiduría para poder distinguir el bien del mal.
He asked for courage to be able to choose good. He asked for temperance to stay on the path of good.
Le pide templanza para mantenerse en el camino del bien. Y cuando llegan
and when they reach a position of power, the criterion of justice is important to act in a just way. When you do that, economic policies are fair, therefore they are efficient, and that will bring the vote sooner or later. Now, when you start from the efficiency of the politician to capture votes, that derives an economic inefficiency and therefore injustice, and ends badly. And the last point is that we did not invent anything either. It was already in the boards of the law. It was in the commandments that the Creator gave to Moses in the mountain. When he came down from the mountain, and there were the 10 commandments, in fact, in the first commandment, I am quoting the Exodus, when the Creator gives them the 10 commandments, the first commandment, what he does is a declaration of freedom. He says, I am your God, the one who took you from the house of slavery, the one who took you out of Egypt. That is, the first commandment declared freedom in the commandments. It is also not you will kill. That is, the respect for life. You will not steal, the respect for property. Do not raise false testimony. That would be good for journalists to take that reflection, but they like to defend the leftists who put money in it. Therefore, if you embrace the Christian Jewish values,
por lo tanto, si ustedes abrazan los valores judeos cristianos,
you are going to derive policies that are just, and those just policies are efficient, and they will drive economic growth to the maximum, and therefore it will bring prosperity
esa prosperidad,
And that prosperity will also bring electoral accompaniment. However,
sin embargo, cuando ustedes
when you
toman
take the
los
anti-values that are envy,
antivalores,
hatred, resentment, that
la
is,
envidia, el odio, el resentimiento, es decir, todo sobre lo que se basa a la izquierda,
everything about what is based on the left, how natural it is to embrace that sinister ideology created
ideología siniestra creada por un satanista declarado,
by a declared Satanist. What is going to generate is what I always generate: misery, hatred, hunger,
miseria, odio, hambre, guerra.
war. Therefore, it is clear what the choice must be.
Está clara cuál debe ser la elección. Es la filosofía
Is Greek philosophy, Roman law, natural law, the Stoics, and Christian Jewish values.
derecho natural, los estoicos y los valores judeos cristianos. Si uno toma decisiones,
If one makes decisions based on those elements, you will bring prosperity, and we will see.
traerán prosperidad y vamos. Miren, nosotros fuimos expulsados del paraíso.
We were expelled from paradise. We cannot return to paradise, but we can
Pero sí podemos hacer que el paraíso vuelva a la tierra.
make paradise return to earth. That is not only in Judaism, but in Christianity.
Sino en el cristianismo. De hecho, el propio Padre Nuestro dice,
In fact, our own Father says, "Make your will so on earth as in heaven."
o sea, venga a nosotros tu
That is,
reino.
come to us your kingdom. God is, we cannot return to paradise because we were expelled,
Porque fuimos expulsados. Pero podemos hacer
but
cosas.
we can do things that replicate paradise if we respect the table of law. Paradise will.
Si nosotros respetamos la tabla de la ley, el paraíso va a venir a nosotros. La prosperidad
Come to us, prosperity will come to us. Therefore, we will live better and in peace. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias.